The tear sliced through the air like a blade, cutting into the frozen silence of the terminal. Ethan Walker's boarding pass fell to the floor, splitting cleanly into 2 pieces, as if it had just been sentenced. Lindsay Harper stood across from him, her eyes cold as glass. Her mouth curved into a thin smile that was half contempt, half triumph. "You do not belong in this area," she said, her voice sharp as a knife, loud enough for nearby passengers to stop, look up, and stare. Ethan didn't answer. He simply stood there, unmoving like a stone, planted in the flow of people gathering around him. But deep in his eyes, something shifted slow, compressed, then sinking like an undercurrent. Lindsay mistook it for submission, but it was something else, something she was not perceptive enough to see the silence of power standing in the wrong place. A cold draft from the ventilation swept across the hall, carrying sharp announcements, clattering suitcases, a child crying somewhere in the distance. But it was the moment Lindsay tore the ticket she believed belonged to someone else, someone not like her, that made the entire space collapse into a single thin line, the line of every gaze aimed at Ethan. "Please step aside. You are blocking the boarding line." Lindsay continued this time without a smile, only the impatience of someone who believed the system would always side with her. She didn't even call security. She didn't need to. In her mind, he was the kind of man who needed only one cold command to step away, a black man in a simple suit, carrying an unbranded leather case, daring to stand in the first-class boarding lane. Absurd. In Lindsay's mind, the mistake could only be his. Ethan bent down and picked up the 2 halves of the torn ticket. The paper trembled slightly in his hand, but his hand itself was unnervingly steady. No one saw his breath tighten, but everyone saw his shoulders stiffen as if he had just taken a stone to the chest. Then he rose, slowly, deliberately, with a clarity that made the air tilt. His posture shifted the entire axis of the hall, though Lindsay still didn't see it. "Are you not listening to me?" she snapped louder now, trying to press her voice over his silence. "I said you do not belong in this area." A middle-aged man behind them scoffed, probably booked the wrong class again. A woman whispered, "Doesn't look like someone who flies." First class, their words did not cut flesh. They cut through history, through what Ethan had lived, endured, and buried deep in his bones. His grandmother once told him, "They will look at you and think they know you. Always remember they know nothing." Today those words returned like a bell. Lindsay folded her arms. "Do you want me to call security?" A few meters away, 3 guards began paying attention, but they didn't move. They saw the uniformed attendant. They saw the passenger. They saw skin tone, and they instantly decided which side they were on. Ethan looked at Lindsay and spoke for the first time. "You just tore my ticket." His voice was low, firm, steady, not angry, but carrying something that made Lindsay freeze for half a second. Something that didn't match her assumptions. A quiet authority, not loud or threatening, but gathering like a storm. "If the ticket is wrong, it should be torn," she replied, trying to reclaim her advantage. "Your name isn't on the first-class list. Do not make this harder." But Ethan knew the truth. His ticket was not wrong. It had been booked by his own executive team. It was for the flight he chose to experience as a regular passenger before stepping into the conference room to run the entire airport system. Lindsay had no idea, and she didn't think she needed one. In her mind, the hierarchy was already set. She was above, he was below, and that was enough to justify tearing it. Ethan looked down at the torn ticket on the floor, fragments of an invisible but heavy accusation. He drew in a slow breath, deep and cold. When he lifted his head, something in him had changed. Not loud, not furious. A quiet strength that made anyone looking at him feel like they were standing before the glass walls of a skyscraper, seeing themselves shrink. The camera of imagination zoomed in his eyes still, his jaw set, his chin locked. Lindsay stepped closer, almost pushing Step out of the line immediately. "Do not force me to file a violation report." Ethan didn't move. And in that moment, the entire terminal seemed to fall silent. Something was about to crack, not him, but Lindsay's illusion of authority. Because just then, a voice called out from across the hall, "Mr. Walker." Lindsay flinched. A group of people in dark suits rushed toward them, their faces tense, their steps urgent, moving like they had just received a high-level security alert. Leading them was Daniel Brooks, the airport's chief operating officer, in his early 50s, slightly out of breath. "We apologize for the delay, sir. The board is waiting for you in the executive conference room. We must go immediately." Lindsay turned to stone. She looked at Daniel. She looked at Ethan. Then at the torn halves of the ticket in his hand. He wasn't in the wrong area. He hadn't booked the wrong seat. He did belong in first class. And Lindsay Harper had just torn the ticket of the man who owned the airport. Color drained from her face, as if someone had dragged a saturation slider to 0. Her body froze, trapped in the center of the widening stairs around her. Everyone understood. But Lindsay understood last. Ethan bent down again, picking up the two torn halves, gently, almost paradoxically soft for the weight of the moment. He looked at Lindsay, not angry, not harsh, just a look. Every person who has ever been wrongly judged would recognize a look that aims straight at conscience. Then he turned and walked away with the airport leadership team, leaving Lindsay standing like someone who had just triggered an explosion beneath her own feet. Because what Lindsay never imagined, and what the entire system was about to face, was a simple truth. She had not just insulted a passenger, she had insulted the man with the power to rewrite her entire career. And this story of injustice had only just begun. The moment Lindsay tore the ticket from Ethan's hand didn't fade. It clung to him like a slow, burning wound as he stepped into the airport's executive conference room. No one seated around the glossy walnut table knew that just minutes earlier, their new owner had been humiliated in the terminal, as if he were someone unworthy of standing in the first-class line. Ethan entered without a noise, but his presence shifted the rhythm of the room. Every gaze locked onto him, some respectful, some tense, some quietly laced with doubt and a concealed disdain. Thomas Granger was the one who watched him the longest. His stare was cold-sharp, pressing against Ethan like a silent test. He did not need to speak. His eyes already delivered the unspoken message. "I do not believe you deserve to sit here." Ethan met the look without flinching. Others might yield, but he would not. For a brief moment, two forces, one old, one new, collided in a silence dense as a lake surface just before a storm. Daniel Brooks, the head of operations, spoke first as if trying to cut through the tightening air. He reported on passenger flow, slow processing zones, and long-standing bottlenecks throughout the airport. Ethan did not sit back in his chair like the others. He leaned forward, fingers interlaced his eyes, sweeping across every chart, every word, every line of data, like a strategist studying a battle map before a campaign. Nothing escaped him. And that unsettled Thomas. Thomas cleared his throat and cut into the presentation. When he spoke, his voice was soft, but wrapped in a sheath of steel. "We have run this airport for decades. Sudden reforms could destabilize operations, especially with your different leadership style." Ethan heard the last word clearly. It was not explicit, but it said enough for someone who had endured thousands of evaluative looks to recognize the truth immediately. Different, meaning not like them, meaning not belonging to them, meaning unworthy of sitting beside them. Ethan did not react. He did not need to. The silence in the room thickened again, no longer empty, but charged like a tightened string tuned to a high pitch. As Daniel continued reporting on long-standing staffing issues, Ethan catalogued everything, not with a pen, but with his sharp memory. What he heard from the management team aligned disturbingly well with the way Lindsay had treated him. The dismissiveness, the assumption of superiority, the confidence that the system would never question them. A puzzle piece clicked into place, then another, and another. What Lindsay had done to him was not an accident, not a careless moment. It was the visible tip of a culture embedded so deeply that people like her believed they had the right to decide who was worthy of stepping into first class. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. Memories drifted back to Alabama, where his grandmother once told him, "You will walk into rooms where people are not used to seeing you. Do not let them teach you how to see yourself." He opened his eyes. The lines on his face sharpened. Something within him shifted, slow but powerful, shaped by every misjudgment he had ever endured. When Ethan requested to see the internal reports on customer complaints, especially cases involving staff attitude, the room seemed to drop several degrees colder. Two managers exchanged glances. Thomas paused for the briefest beat, just enough for a perceptive man to catch it. Ethan caught it. They already knew what he would find, and they did not want him to find it. Ethan placed both hands on the table, his gaze sweeping across the room like a beam of light cutting through a dark forest. There was no anger, no raised voice, only a stillness that made it hard for others to breathe, the stillness of a man who had spent his entire life pushing through disregard and who now stood in the seat of power where he could reshape an entire system. He spoke his voice low, yet sharp like a blade sliding across glass. "I want every piece of data, all of it, no exceptions." No one replied, but everyone understood. Power had shifted. The ice beneath them was cracking. A seismic wave was building from his silence. And Lindsay Harper, the woman who had torn his ticket and ignited this entire undercurrent, had no idea that wave was already heading directly toward her. Lindsay sat curled up in the staff break room, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her nails dug into her skin, stinging sharply, but that pain was nothing compared to the crushing terror tightening around her chest, the terror of someone who had just made a mistake that could not be undone. She thought he was just another passenger, an anonymous face in a long line. Someone she could shove aside, intimidate, scold, tear a ticket from, then walk away as if it meant nothing. But with every minute that passed, after Ethan disappeared into the executive meeting room with senior leadership, every breath felt like a sledgehammer striking her skull. He was not anonymous. He was not small. He was not weak. He was the owner of the airport, the man with authority to rewrite procedures, to sign termination orders, to alter her entire career with a single sentence. And she had torn his ticket. Maria Reynolds stepped inside her face, cold as stone. No polite smile, no casual greeting, only the expression of someone who had spent nearly 3 decades in aviation and recognized the scent of a catastrophic problem. Lindsay opened her mouth, her voice trembling like a string pulled out of tune. "Maria, I didn't know. I did not. What did you do?" Maria cut in her voice, heavy as a steel door slamming shut. "Tell the truth. All of it." Lindsay swallowed hard. Her lips parted, but her throat felt strangled. Finally the words broke out in fragments, each one like a stone she threw at herself. "I thought he didn't belong in first class. The ticket looked wrong. I checked then you tore it." Maria finished the sentence for her. Lindsay went silent. The room seemed to lose all its air. Maria unlocked her tablet, swiped once, and Lindsay saw lines she had always pretended no one cared about. 3 customer complaints this year, 2 co-worker reports, 1 internal warning, not yet signed. "You think I did not know?" Maria asked, not angry, but sharp enough to tighten Lindsay's chest. "Not one time, not one incident. And this time, you chose the worst possible person to treat that way." Lindsay exhaled sharply, almost choking. "I did not intend to discriminate. I was just frustrated. I thought, and that is the problem?" Maria tilted her head, eyes fixed on Lindsay. "You thought, you assumed, you decided, and you behaved as if your assumptions were the law." Lindsay wanted to defend herself, to argue, to deny. But in Maria's calm face, she saw the truth she had spent years dodging. She had done this many times, and the system had let her slip away. Not because she was right, but because no one had enough authority to make her realize she was wrong. Until today. A notification chimed on Maria's device. She glanced at the screen. Her eyebrows drew together the sign Lindsay feared most. The executive board has requested an urgent meeting with airline leadership. There is mention of flight attendant conduct from this morning. Lindsay shot up her chair, slamming into the wall. "No, no, are they going to fire me? I do not know." Maria answered, blunt as a verdict. "But this is no longer about a torn ticket. This is about culture, about the system. And Ethan Walker is not the kind of man who lets things slide." Lindsay grabbed her head with both hands. Tears welled up but would not fall. Her throat burned. The small room seemed to shrink, pressing against her chest inch by inch. In her mind, Ethan's face appeared again, that steady, quiet, chilling gaze that needed no shouting, no anger. A silence that terrified her so deeply she didn't dare breathe too loud. She had seen that kind of look before, from people with real power, people who understood the value of restraint, people who could make an entire room tremble without raising their voice. And now she understood. Ethan was one of them. A soft knock on the door made Lindsay jolt upright. A staff member announced, "Airline leadership wants to see you." "Right now?" Lindsay stood, her legs weak, as if they no longer had weight. When the door opened, the hallway light hit her face, and she squinted. Every sound in her mind faded, leaving only one sentence ringing like metal scraping stone: "I have ruined everything." But what she didn't know, what was far worse, was that in the meeting room across the hall, Ethan Walker had just seen the internal complaint data. And what he saw did not simply confirm her actions. It revealed the blueprint of a sickness embedded deep within the entire system. A sickness he now had the power to confront. Lindsay thought she was facing the biggest crisis of her life. But that was only the surface of the storm forming around her, a storm that would erase every illusion of safety she had ever believed in. Ethan sat alone in the small conference room, beside the executive office, the white lights reflecting off a face, drawn tight like heated steel. On the table before him lay the stack of internal reports the technical team had just delivered, a pile of documents, thick as an investigative dossier, filled with numbers that would make anyone with a conscience shudder. Employee complaints, ignored accusations, passenger grievances stamped with the familiar phrase, "not enough evidence." A system that pretended not to see because it did not want to see. And within all those pages, Lindsay's behavior was no longer an isolated incident. It was a symptom, a sign of a disease rooted so deep it had reached the foundation. Every page he turned tightened his heartbeat, as if an invisible rope wrapped another coil around him. Memories from Alabama crept in. Memories of rejections, of being underestimated, of being dismissed by the very same type of gaze Lindsay had used on him. Ethan thought he had grown numb to those looks. But when those looks surfaced inside the very system he had spent nearly $1 billion to rescue, it was no longer personal. It was the betrayal of a culture he now had to confront. The door burst open. Caleb Richardson stepped in without a knocking, like a man who knew what he was about to say, could not wait even a second. I witnessed everything on the flight. His voice was low and direct, no hesitation. Ethan looked up, not surprised, but his eyes deepened with a heavier weight. "Speak." Caleb stood straight as if delivering an emergency briefing in a cockpit. It was not just poor attitude. She mocked you, deliberately ignored your requests, and made fun of your voice in front of other passengers. Ethan did not move. He did not frown. He did not clench his fist. His stillness made Caleb's voice falter. "I know you do not need defending. But I also know this kind of behavior doesn't stop with one person." Ethan placed the report stack down, sliding each page neatly. The sound of the paper hitting the table was sharp, like a blade gliding across metal. "I have seen enough." Caleb swallowed hard. "What are you going to do?" Ethan looked directly at him, a gaze that cut through the polished veneer of the aviation industry, through the layers of its selective customer-first culture. "I am going to change the way this place treats human beings." His voice was calm, but beneath that calm was the energy of a storm about to rip off a roof. "Not just for myself, but for the people who have no position to fight back." Caleb nodded slightly. He understood. He had spent his whole career inside a culture where black pilots had to work twice as hard just to be seen as acceptable. Ethan rose, slowly, with absolute certainty. "I want to meet the airline leadership. Right now. Right now." Caleb stepped out. Ethan remained alone in the room that had grown so quiet he could hear the clock ticking each beat like a countdown before the sky split open. He turned his chair toward the window, looking down at the vast terminal, below the place where his ticket was torn, where Lindsay believed she had the authority to decide who deserved respect. From this height, she seemed small, not because he was above her, but because she had shrunk herself into the narrow confines of ignorance. His phone vibrated softly. A message from the legal team. "The internal complaint files are complete. Evidence confirms years of non-transparent handling across the system." Ethan closed his eyes. A cold current ran down his spine, not because of the data, but because he realized the battle ahead was no longer about him and Lindsay. It was a war against a culture that treated discrimination as not serious humiliation, as not proven, and injustice as not urgent. And he, as the new owner, was the only one with the power to strip away the dust that had collected over the system for years. A soft knock. Then the door opened. His assistant stepped inside. "They are ready to meet you." Ethan stood the familiar leather briefcase in his hand. His suit, dark beneath the lights, looked like armor that nothing could pierce. As he walked down the hallway, employees watched him with eyes full of curiosity, anticipation, and fear, the kind of fear that appears when an old order is about to fall apart. Ethan did not look at them, but every step he took echoed against the tile floors, the steady rhythm of a man no longer walking for himself, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or told they did not belong. The airline's conference room was at the end of the hall. Frosted glass panels reflected his silhouette, a sharp and steady outline, carrying the force of a rising storm. He placed his hand on the door handle. In that brief moment, he inhaled deeply, gathering every memory of humiliation from childhood to the ripped ticket, compressing them into a single reservoir of silent strength. The door opened. The airline leadership turned to face him. Lindsay Harper still had no idea, but in just a few minutes when the meeting began, when the truth of the system was laid bare, when the data Ethan carried was placed on the table, her career and the culture of the entire airline would never be the same again. Because the man they thought was just a passenger, standing in the wrong line, was the man who would rewrite the rules they had relied on to place themselves above others. The airline's large conference room glowed under harsh white lights. Yet no brightness was strong enough to disperse the tension thickening the air. Senior executives sat in rose suits, perfectly pressed faces, trying to stay composed, but their eyes flicked nervously between one another, as if all of them sensed that this meeting was unlike any they had ever attended. Ethan walked in. No wasted movement. The temperature of the room seemed to shift, as though the space had just lost a measure of oxygen. His gaze swept across each person, slow and deep, and whoever it landed on felt their spine stiffen. It was not the gaze of someone seeking enemies, but of someone about to open a door behind which lay truths no one wished to confront. The chief executive of the airline, Mark Ellison, attempted a polite smile, though his lips trembled. "Mr. Walker, thank you for coming. We understand that this morning's incident caused inconvenience for you. And it was not just an inconvenience," Ethan cut in. The words were not loud, but they slashed through the air like a sharpened blade. Silence crashed over the room, a brief, suspended moment. Then Ethan placed his briefcase on the table. The sound wasn't loud, yet it carried weight, making several executives flinch, as if something heavier than metal had been dropped. He opened the case and pulled out a stack of documents. No one dared breathe too deeply. These, he said slowly, each word weighted like concrete being set into place, are the complete complaint statistics regarding employee conduct over the past 5 years. Most of them, he added, were never addressed. Another executive, the head of human resources, tried to speak, but Ethan's glance swept across him, a single look that crushed every excuse forming in the man's throat. He fell silent. Ethan flipped to the first page. Every year, hundreds of passengers report being dismissed, mocked, questioned about their ability to pay, questioned about whether they deserve their seat. They are presumed wrong simply because they do not match the first-class image you have built in your minds. In that moment, Lindsay Harper, required to attend the meeting, stood frozen in a corner of the room. Her face grew paler with every word Ethan spoke. No one looked at her. But everyone knew the next part of the truth would inevitably lead to her name. Ethan placed a document on the table, turning it toward the airline leadership. And here. It was the internal report detailing Lindsay's actions. Each line was a blade, exposing every belittling comment, every deliberate refusal to acknowledge him, every time she mocked his southern accent in front of passengers. Lindsay staggered slightly, her fingers twisted together, nails digging into skin. But Ethan still had not looked at her. He addressed the entire room instead. What happened this morning was not a mistake by one individual. His voice was steady, each word deliberately anchored. It was created by a culture. Mark swallowed hard. "Mr. Walker, are you saying I am saying?" Ethan continued, his tone sharp, as glass stretched to the point of breaking, that this system has learned to ignore discrimination. It has learned to protect misconduct. It has learned to believe that someone like me cannot, should not, and will never belong in first class. The room fell into absolute stillness. Lindsay felt as if ice had encased her body. Her breaths came shallow and broken, but no one heard. All attention was fixed on the only person in the room whose calm seemed almost supernatural in the storm. Ethan leaned back, not to rest, but to claim the space. "I reviewed hundreds of personnel reports," he said. "Not one was handled appropriately. Not one resulted in meaningful change." An executive stammered, We have regular training." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Training means nothing when the people taking it know they will never be held accountable." Silence swallowed the room again. Not the ordinary kind, but the kind that forms when metal is compressed right before it explodes. Only then did Ethan finally turn his gaze to Lindsay. She felt it like an electric shock. Miss Harper Ethan said not harsh, not raised, simply a name, spoken in a way that shattered the confidence she once wore like armor. Lindsay parted her lips to speak, but the sound that escaped was thin, broken. Ethan continued, "What you did this morning was not an accident. It was nurtured by the silence of the people in this room." His gaze swept over them once more. Every person felt called out. But identifying blame is not my goal. Ethan placed his pen on the table. A soft sound. Yet it marked the beginning of the real storm. "My goal," he said, his voice dropping lower, stronger, like the hum of a jet engine about to ignite the runway, "is to change the power structure that made you believe you could treat others that way." Lindsay lowered her head. Her breath splintered into small spasms in her chest. Ethan did not pause. He turned back to the leadership. "I am about to issue a demand." Everyone straightened instinctively, as though awaiting the verdict of the highest court. "This demand," Ethan said, "will determine whether this system continues to exist." The air itself seemed to vibrate. One executive whispered, "What do you want?" Ethan looked directly at them, eyes sharp like steel forged in fire. "I want this entire system held accountable, starting with all of you." No one could find a response. But they all understood one thing: this moment was not a threat. It was the beginning of reconstruction. And Lindsay Harper, who once believed she held power, now stood witnessing true power entering the room. Quiet, controlled, but strong enough to flip the board entirely. Only one question remained: would this system resist or crumble under the steps of the man they once mistook? For just another passenger, Maria Reynolds pushed open the door to the HR meeting room with enough force that the hinges struck the wall, the sound ringing out like a warning shot. Lindsay flinched, almost jumping out of her chair. Her face was pale, her breaths uneven, her eyes wide, like someone who had just escaped an explosion. But the real explosion was coming from Maria. She dropped a stack of files onto the table, the weight of it landing like a verdict. "Do you know what this is?" Lindsay swallowed hard, her throat burning. Maria opened the folder each page, turning like the slice of a blade. Complaints from passengers, from co-workers, from pilots, from new flight attendants, all with the same themes: discriminatory behavior, insulting comments, selective treatment. Lindsay gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. I didn't mean to. I didn't think people took it that seriously. Maria looked up. Her eyes were sharp as forged metal. That is the problem. You didn't think it was serious, because you have never had to pay a price, and this system has allowed you to believe you never would. Lindsay felt as if the floor had been pulled from beneath her. Her world tilted. Maria slammed another document onto the table, a summons for the next morning's meeting with Ethan Walker. The line required presence. Mandatory sent a twisting shock through Lindsay's stomach. He wants to meet me. Not just to meet Maria, folded her arms. He wants you to face what you have done. Lindsay trembled so hard, her chair creaked beneath her. Maria studied her for a long moment, not with cruelty, not with sympathy, but with the sternness of someone who had seen the cost of silence for too many years. "Do you think you are the victim here?" Maria asked, her voice, low and deliberate, reaching into every dark corner of the room. Lindsay said nothing. "What Mr. Walker is doing," Maria continued, "is not about destroying your career. He is destroying the culture that created you." Lindsay heard the words but did not fully understand them, or perhaps did not dare to. But deep in her chest, a vague fear spread like an oil stain. A knock. An employee rushed in. Ms. Reynolds' HR needs Lindsay immediately, and the airport just forwarded new material related to the incident. Maria narrowed her eyes. What material? All video and audio recorded by passengers, and both security cameras at the boarding door. Lindsay felt her head empty out, every sound flattened into a giant vacuum. "Video," she whispered. The employee nodded, tense. Many people witnessed it, and some sent the recordings straight to the executive board. They said it must be handled immediately because it affects the airline's image. Lindsay could no longer stand. The chair caught her as she collapsed into it. Maria watched, not satisfied, not triumphant, only weary. "Lindsay," she said, "if you want any chance of surviving this, you must learn 2 words you have never taken seriously. Take responsibility." Lindsay stared at her trembling hands. In her mind, the entire morning replayed itself. Ethan's eyes, his calm, the way he stood, the way he did not raise his voice even when she humiliated him. And suddenly, she saw the truth she had been blind to. He was not weak, not lower, not lesser. She had insulted a man who was stronger than her in every way except the rank she assumed he held. Her ego was not only wrong, it was blind. Lindsay tried to speak. "I want to apologize. Maybe he will." Maria cut her off. "Do not expect that to save you." Lindsay froze. Maria tilted her head, her voice low, like a bell tolling at the end of a ceremony. Ethan Walker is not the kind of man who forgives because of a few soft words when the truth is already in front of him. He wants to change a system, not soothe a single person. Lindsay's mind spun. Every muscle in her face slackened like she had been struck. Then what should I do? Maria looked at her for a long time, as if weighing whether Lindsay was truly capable of understanding what was coming. "You must walk into tomorrow's meeting, not to save your job," she said, "but to prove you deserve to become someone different, not the person who boarded that flight this morning." A heavy silence settled over the room. No hum of the air conditioning, no distant announcements from the terminal. Only Lindsay's strained breathing and Maria's footsteps leaving her alone with the raw shape of her own mistake. But elsewhere in the airport, a far larger battle was shifting. Ethan received the copied video files from security. He watched without expression, but the muscles in his face tightened with each moment replayed. Lindsay mocking his voice, the passengers who laughed, the stares filled with suspicion the moment the ticket was torn. That part didn't hurt him, it chilled him. Because what he saw was not just an insult aimed at him. It was a pattern of behavior that had been allowed, repeated, reinforced by layers of management. A system not just flawed, but rotten. He turned off the video, set the phone down. A decision formed in him, slow but precise, like hardened metal being tempered in flame. There would be no quiet resolution, no polite apology accepted, no scapegoat in one employee to cover the decay of an entire structure. He had not come to pull a weed. He had come to uproot the garden. Tomorrow, Lindsay would stand before him. But what she didn't know was that she would not be the only one being judged. The entire system behind her was about to be exposed, and Ethan Walker was preparing to ask the question no one in the aviation industry ever wanted to hear. Why should a passenger have to fight discrimination inside the very airport he owns? The silence after that question would burn through every disguise the system depended on. Lindsay believed the storm was headed toward her, but the truth was, she was only the first drop. The real downpour was on its way. Ethan stepped into the airport's grand boardroom, where the board of directors sat waiting in a tight arc, pulled taut like a bowstring, drawn to its final notch. No one spoke, but everyone could feel the weight crawling across the room, an invisible force, whispering that the balance of power inside these walls was about to be crushed and rebuilt from the ground up. The lights reflected off his face, carving out the sharp, unyielding lines of a man who was no longer here to observe, but to act. Thomas Granger sat at the center, fingers interlocked, trying to maintain the calm of an experienced fox. But in his eyes flickered a nervousness he could not hide. To the left, several board members exchanged glances, as if trying to guess where Ethan would strike first. To the right, two attorneys cleared their throats, their stacks of documents sitting before them like flimsy shields against the storm approaching. Ethan did not sit immediately. He stopped behind his chair, one hand resting on its back, as if he held the entire room in his grip. His gaze swept across every person, lingering just long enough for each one to feel exposed down to the bone. "Let us begin." His voice was low, clear, and rang in the air like metal slamming against stone. Then he sat, slowly, deliberately, as if the simple act of sitting marked the start of a reckoning. Daniel Brooks opened his laptop to begin presenting the operations report. But Ethan raised a hand, stopping him instantly, not out of fear, but because everyone understood that once Ethan entered this phase, every word mattered. "I want to address the internal culture first." One sentence, yet the entire room changed its rhythm of breathing. Thomas leaned forward, his voice carrying a hint of mockery. "Culture. I believe the real problem right now is financial." "Not you believe that. Because you did not read the report," Ethan cut in, eyes locked on Thomas. "Or worse, you read it and failed to understand what it is saying." The words fell like a blade. A few board members looked at one another, startled by his bluntness. Thomas tightened his fingers, trying to appear unbothered. Ethan nodded to Daniel. "Open the internal complaint file." The large screen lit up. Hundreds of lines scrolled down, dates, employee names, discriminatory incidents, complaints left unresolved. By the third page, silence in the room had shifted from discomfort to something heavier, shame forced into daylight. "I have reviewed every single one," Ethan said, his voice cold as night wind slicing through glass. "Every line is a story of injustice. Every sentence is evidence of neglect. Every unresolved case is a person insulted with no one to defend them." Ethan turned fully toward the board, his voice lower but sharp enough to cut. And this system allowed it to continue year after year. No one argued. No one dared. Thomas gave a forced laugh, clinging to the last threads of authority. "I do not deny mistakes were made. But calling the system broken is an exaggeration. Broken," Ethan tilted his head. "Broken is when something accidentally slips out of alignment. What I see here is not accidental. It was built, preserved, protected by the very people sitting in this room." A small clack echoed. Someone had dropped their pen. Ethan stood and walked toward the screen, pointing at a column of data. Why was not a single complaint handled according to policy? Why were repeat offenders never disciplined? Why were passengers who were insulted labeled as uncooperative? He turned eyes aimed directly at Thomas like a spear launched without hesitation. "And why did 40% of these incidents occur under your department?" Thomas stiffened. "Are you implying I am not implying?" Ethan said. "I am stating." The room felt stripped of air. "You created an environment where discriminatory behavior was considered acceptable if it kept things quiet." "But quiet," Ethan said, stepping back to his chair, his movement calm enough to terrify, "is simply another word for complicity." He sat, a stillness radiating from him that made the whole table feel unstable. When a flight attendant believes she has the right to tear up a passenger's ticket just because she dislikes how they look, that system is not accidental. It reflects the way its leaders see people. For the first time, Thomas's mask slipped. "You are accusing me of..." Ethan cut him off again. "I am speaking the truth." A wave of embarrassment, fear, and anger rippled through the board. No one stepped in. Ethan placed his hands on the table and leaned forward. His voice dropped, turning dense. Powerful, the voice of a man who had endured discrimination his entire life, and now held the authority to demand repayment. "I invested $800 million into this airport. I did not spend that money to acquire infrastructure. I spent it to dismantle a rotten system." A director stammered. "Then what do you expect us to do?" Ethan looked at each of them slowly, as if carving the answer into their bones. "I expect truth to be spoken. I expect accountability. I expect change from the foundation. And every person in this room will participate or be replaced." It was not a threat. It was not intimidation. It was a statement of fact. And everyone knew no one was exempt. A knock sounded outside. Maria entered, her expression heavy as stone. Beside her stood Lindsay Harper, the woman who had pushed the entire system to its breaking point. The room turned. Some sighed. Some stiffened. Thomas frowned deeply, and Ethan simply lifted his eyes slightly. He did not need to speak. Everyone understood this moment was no longer just a meeting. It was a confrontation between the old system and the man who would decide whether it deserved to exist at all. Lindsay stepped into the room, her legs no longer feeling like they belonged to her. Every step she took echoed in her skull like a hammer striking molten metal. Dozens of executives turned their eyes toward her, but none were colder, sharper, or more piercing than the gaze of the man seated at the head of the table. Ethan Walker did not look at her like she was an employee who had made a mistake. He looked at her the way someone looks at a piece of evidence, a fragment representing something far larger than itself. She swallowed hard, her throat tightening. "Sit down," Ethan said. He did not raise his voice. He did not sharpen it. But the way he said it made Lindsay tremble from her spine to her fingertips. The chair dipped beneath her as she sat, her heartbeat pounding against her ribs like it wanted to break free. Ethan studied her in perfect stillness, the kind of stillness that makes people confess before being questioned. He folded his hands, rested them on the table, tilting his head slightly, as if weighing her entire being through a sheet of glass. "Miss Harper," he began, his voice low compressed, carrying authority. "Do you know why you are here?" Lindsay opened her mouth, but no sound escaped. Ethan continued without waiting. "It is not because you tore up my ticket." The air grew thicker. "It is not because you mocked my voice." Several executives held their breath. "It is not because you treated me as someone unworthy." Lindsay blinked rapidly, realizing she was being led toward the core of something far beyond one incident. Ethan leaned forward, his voice lowering but doubling in force. "You are here because you are the perfect example of what this system has created." Lindsay felt something clamp around her chest. Maria stood behind her, silent, but her eyes made it clear she knew Ethan was striking at the root. Ethan went on his tone, sharp enough to shred through the walls themselves. "You think what happened this morning was a moment of impulse. But it was not. It was repetition, year after year, month after month, inside every report that was tossed aside." On the screen, Daniel Brooks pulled up a complaint summary. Lines of text glowed like a list of charges. Lindsay saw her name. Once, twice, many times, each one a cut she could not deny. She tried to breathe, but the air entering her lungs felt like lead. Ethan did not look at the screen. He only looked at her. "Do you know how many people left this airline because of behaviors dismissed as minor?" Lindsay shook her head, nearly choking on her own breath. "Do you know how many lost opportunities because they were not part of the right group? How many passengers were humiliated simply for not fitting your idea of who deserves first class?" She bowed her head, tears spilling silently onto her lap. Ethan did not soften, not because he lacked compassion, but because he understood her tragedy was never hers alone. "I do not want your apology," Ethan said, every word landing like iron. "An apology does not change a system. It only comforts the one giving it." Lindsay drew a sharp breath, hands clasping tightly. Maria placed a steadying hand on her shoulder to keep her from collapsing entirely. Ethan turned to the board, his voice lowering again, but its power never fading. "This is not solely Miss Harper's failure. This is the failure of everyone here who allowed this to happen repeatedly as if it did not matter." Thomas Granger leaned forward, ready to argue, but Ethan shot one brief, cutting glance his way, and Thomas swallowed the words instantly. Then Ethan faced Lindsay again. "Miss Harper," he said slowly, "I will ask one question. Only one." Lindsay lifted her face, her lips trembling. "Why did you think you could treat me that way?" The room plunged into silence. No shifting chairs, no air conditioner hum, only the frantic pounding of Lindsay's heart. She opened her mouth not to defend herself, but to finally speak a truth she had never dared to articulate. Her voice cracked, tiny but honest. "Because I thought you were not important." Shame crushed her like a falling stone. Ethan did not flinch, not a twitch of shock, not a flicker of anger. It was as though he had known the answer long before she spoke it. He leaned back slightly, placing both hands on the table eyes, cutting through the false masks the system had built around itself. And that he said his voice, heavy like a judge's gavel closing a trial, is what I am here to change. A cold wave rippled across the room. Lindsay covered her face, her shoulders shaking with despair. But Ethan was not done with her. He looked at the entire board, the people who had watched silently as their system rotted from within the people who treated injustice like a side matter. No one in this room is allowed to think that any human being is unimportant. His voice dropped one more register so deep and resonant it bent the air. And if anyone still thinks that way, they will no longer have a place here. This was not a statement. It was the opening of a judgment. Lindsay had believed this meeting was about her. But the truth was, she was only the fuse. And Ethan had just turned the cannon toward the system that created her a system that from this moment forward would never be allowed to exist the same way again. The meeting continued, but it no longer resembled a meeting at all. It felt like a quiet earthquake, each fragment of the old system's ceiling cracking loose and falling, and no one in the room could pretend they did not hear the breaking anymore. Ethan rose again. A small movement, yet the entire room tilted with him. He did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to slam a table. He did not need noise. Real power does not need noise. It exists heavy and silent, like its own gravitational field, pulling every gaze toward it. He stepped toward the screen. A new data sheet appeared this time. Not complaints, but Caleb Richardson's detailed analysis of systemic bias in hiring and promotion. A map of a sickness that had spread for many years. The room froze. The numbers were undeniable. Black candidates eliminated in the first round at 4 times the rate of white candidates, with identical experience minority employees needing an average of 3 additional years to earn equivalent promotions, discrimination-related complaints, ending with the familiar phrase, "not enough evidence." Ethan stared at the data as though peering into a mirror, exposing the industry's true face. Then he turned, no longer carrying anger in his eyes. This was judgment, a silence that made even innocent people question their conscience. "We will not call this a mistake," he said. "We will call it what it is, systemic discrimination." A verbal blow, powerful enough to shake the room. Thomas Granger flushed red. He planted his hands on the table, leaning forward as if preparing to fight back. "You are destroying the airport's reputation with baseless accusations." Baseless Ethan rotated his wrist slightly. From his briefcase, he placed another document on the table, this one from the airline's own legal department. "This is last year's report bearing your signature." Thomas froze. Adam, a younger board member, grabbed the copy and skimmed through it, his eyes widening. "You authorized the dismissal of 37 reports because they were not aligned with brand image." The shock rippled through the room. A woman on the board exhaled sharply, attempting but failing to maintain composure. No one looked at Thomas as a leader anymore. They looked at him as a rotten root finally dragged into the daylight. Ethan did not look at Thomas. He faced the room, his voice deep and sweeping like a desert storm. "I am not here to hunt down an individual." He let the silence fall heavy as iron. "I am here to uproot a culture that allowed him to exist." Those words were not an attack. They were the truth, and the truth sharpened every breath in the room. Lindsay sat frozen, her fingers digging into her palms until the nails left marks. She had never seen a meeting like this, A moment where one man stood up and, by telling the story of generations pushed aside, turned it into a blade, slicing through every layer of pretense in the system. Ethan inhaled slowly, gathering the storm into himself. Starting today, he said, I am ordering 3 immediate actions. Everyone leaned forward. No one dared blink. First, all discrimination. Related complaints, past and present, will be reinvestigated from the beginning by an independent team that I appoint. A tense pause. Then he continued. Second, the entire leadership team will undergo a full cultural competency evaluation. Not a meaningless 1-hour workshop. A real evaluation with real consequences. Thomas went pale. Everyone understood masks were about to be ripped away. Ethan looked directly at him as he spoke the third requirement. Third, any leader who has ever approved the dismissal of a complaint will be suspended until the investigation is complete. No one breathed. Thomas shot to his feet, face burning, voice cracking. You do not have the authority. I do. Ethan said softly, but with enough force to cut his protest in half. As the owner, as the man who invested $800 million into this place, and as someone who will not allow silence to protect wrongdoing for one more day. Those words marked the collapse of every defense Thomas had brought with him. Not a single person in the room stood with him. Ethan turned toward Lindsay. No anger, no satisfaction, no contempt. Only the gaze of someone who had seen the full landscape, understood the roots, and recognized that she was one link in a long chain of a failing system. Miss Harper. Lindsay swallowed her tears. Tomorrow, Ethan said slowly, you will attend the first cultural evaluation session. Not for forgiveness. Lindsay nodded shakily, hands trembling uncontrollably. But to begin understanding, Ethan concluded why what you did this morning did not just insult one person. It insulted an entire community. No one spoke. No one dared. Ethan rose. His posture tall, sharp, carrying the presence of a man who had grown accustomed to being underestimated and now held the power to redefine every standard. The door opened as he stepped away. And in that moment, the entire board understood that what they had just experienced was not a crisis meeting. It was a declaration marking the beginning of a full reconstruction of the airport's culture. Lindsay watched Ethan's silhouette disappear through the doorway and finally understood her life had turned a new page. Not a page she wanted. A page she had no choice but to confront. Because from this moment on, Ethan Walker was no longer the victim of disregard. He was the man who would end it. Ethan didn't leave the boardroom immediately. He stood at the doorway for a few seconds, one hand resting on the cold metal handle, his breathing steady like a man preparing to step into a campaign far larger than any business deal he had ever faced. Inside, the board remained frozen in a thick silence. No one dared move until the door closed behind him. Only then did the room exhale heavy and shaken. But the storm didn't stay in the boardroom. It followed Ethan down the hallway. He walked across the polished floor, his steps calm, yet surrounded by a pressure that shifted the air itself. Staff members stepped aside as he passed, not because they knew who he was, but because something in his expression made anyone who met his eyes feel as though they were moments away from confronting their own mistakes. A solemn silence hung around him, the silence of calculation, not anger. The kind of silence that was far more dangerous than rage. Caleb Richardson caught up to him at the end of the hall. Mr. Walker things in the boardroom, "I know," Ethan said, not slowing down. "They are wondering whether I intend to destroy the system or rebuild it." Caleb drew a breath, tension rippling through him. And the answer Ethan stopped, turned toward him. His eyes were dark and deep, not angry, just absolutely certain. "I am not destroying the system," he said. "I am destroying what is destroying the people inside it." Caleb fell silent. He understood. This was not retaliation. This was revolution. Ethan continued walking, pushing open the door to the glass corridor overlooking the airport's main concourse. Below, thousands of passengers moved in streams, a river of lives, each one carrying its own story, worry, expectation, hope. Ethan looked down at them, his gaze softening for a brief moment, not gentle but profound. He saw himself at 10 years old, standing in another airport, gripping a worn suitcase, his southern accent mocked every time he spoke. He saw his grandmother behind him, placing a steady hand on his shoulder, whispering, "Never let anyone teach you how to value yourself." And now he stood at the highest floor of the airport he owned, not to prove she was right, but to fulfill the promise he made at her bedside, "I will change the places that once looked down on me." His phone vibrated. A message from the legal team: final financial audit complete. Severe misconduct detected involving Thomas's committee. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, like a soldier hearing the final signal before launching a full offensive. Then he opened them sharp, clear, ready. Footsteps approached behind him. It was Daniel Brooks. His face was tense, but in his expression there was respect, the kind that had been growing since the morning. "I have never seen the board so silent," Daniel said. "They are afraid," Ethan replied. "Not of me. Of the truth." Daniel nodded. "Tomorrow is the formal hearing. How are you preparing?" Ethan looked out at the sky beyond the glass. A plane lifted off its engines, roaring, carving arcs of silver through the air. A moment of pure freedom and defiance. "I am not preparing to win a meeting," Ethan said. "I am preparing to change how this industry sees human beings." On his way back to his private office, a young staff member stepped forward, hesitant. Ethan paused, nodding gently for him to speak. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you," the young man said, his voice trembling. "I have seen injustice happen again and again, but no one ever truly stepped in." He choked up. Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder, firm, grounded, a real anchor. "No one stands alone anymore," he said. "Not after today." The atmosphere around them shifted. It was no longer fear. It was hope, the kind that appears when people see a leader who does not just hold authority, but holds integrity. When Ethan entered his office, the entire legal and assistant team rose to their feet. They thought he would immediately order disciplinary action. Instead, Ethan sat down, opened his laptop, and the first thing he did was not draft a punishment. He opened the proposal for the aviation scholarship program for minority students, the one he had planned to announce next month. He studied it for a long moment. His eyes softened not from doubt, but from seeing the future he was fighting to protect. "We will announce this program sooner," Ethan said. "Right after the hearing. The world needs to see what happens when a system changes the right way, not through fear, but through opportunity." The room fell silent. Everyone understood they were witnessing a turning point, not just for the airport, but for the entire aviation industry. At the end of the day, when Ethan left the office, the sky outside was already dark. Streetlights cast warm gold across the hallway. He slowed as he noticed Lindsay standing alone at the far end, Her shoulders slumped like someone who had lost her direction. She looked up when she heard his steps. Her eyes held fear, remorse, and something else, something rare, awakening. Ethan did not look away. But he didn't offer anger either. What he gave her was a steady, bright gaze that made her confront herself in it. Tomorrow, he said, his voice low, firm as steel but without harshness, you will not only face me. You will face the version of yourself that this system created. Lindsay nodded, eyes red. I will not run from it anymore. Ethan nodded once. Good. Because real change does not begin with an apology. It begins with truth. He walked away. His silhouette stretched across the floor, long and unwavering, like the new spine of the airport itself. And Lindsay stood watching him disappear into the light, knowing one thing with absolute clarity. Tomorrow was not the day she lost her job. Tomorrow was the day the system would be judged, and Ethan Walker would be the one holding the scales. From the perspective of an expert in organizational equity, this story reveals an undeniable truth. Injustice does not begin with grand actions. It begins with small behaviors that are forgiven for far too long. Ethan's courage does not lie in confronting an individual, but in confronting an entire system where silence had been treated as the standard. The moment he chose to stand up opened the door to real change, change built on transparency, accountability, and respect for human dignity. If you believe every organization needs people who dare to say enough, then like and subscribe to help spread stories that empower communities, and leave a comment with the phrase, "Change now," to affirm that you stand on the side of justice and dignity.